I rise to speak to my Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Amendment Domestic Reserve Bill. With this legislation, I deliver on my commitments to ensure the Australian people benefit from the natural energy and mineral resources they own. I've been fighting for this for many years. Australia has tremendous reserves of natural energy resources, some of the largest in the world. Yet we face energy shortages, driving up our energy prices to among the highest in the world. This makes no sense. This natural wealth, which should make every Australian rich, has been squandered by successive Labor and coalition governments over decades, allowing other countries to use our continent as a cheap dirt mine. It is fundamentally wrong any way you look at it. It is a betrayal of the Australian people, incredibly damaging to our economy, and makes us an international laughingstock. I can only imagine what Norwegians think of Australia's approach. They are laughing all the way to the bank. Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, built on revenue from the country's oil deposits in the North Sea, is now valued at $2.17 trillion Australian dollars. That's almost $400,000 per Norwegian. It's easily twice as much as most Australian superannuation balances, although that's probably an unfair comparison because our super comes from our individual earnings. Norwegians contribute nothing personally. All that wealth comes from their natural resources and governments which have wisely created and invested in it. When I think about the wealth Australia could have generated from natural resources which dwarf Norway's, I get very angry. This criminal waste of our natural wealth is an outrage. It's why I introduced my Benefit to Australia Bill last year, hoping to generate more revenue for the nation from the exploitation of our resources. The main parties voted against it, faithfully serving their paymasters in the resources sector and continuing the betrayal of the Australian people. There's been one small step in the right direction recently, and it's something for which I've lobbied the past 3 Prime Ministers. Actually, on my first meeting with the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, I pleaded with him with regards to the PRRT of the North West Shelf. And now he's proposed changes to the Petroleum Rent Resource Tax, or the PRRT, are forecast to increase revenue by about $2.4 billion, something that we've never had before. And in comparison, Qatar reaps $26 billion a year in government revenue from their gas, and we export more, yet we only get $2.4 billion, and that's only forecast. It's a positive step, if a very small one, and continues the trend of the major parties adopting many of One Nation's policies. This legislation is another step in the right direction. Australia has some of the largest reserves of natural gas on the planet, and we're the world's biggest exporter. About 93% of these reserves are in Commonwealth waters, concentrated in the northwest shelf of Western Australia. The majority of it is exported to Asian markets, so much, in fact, that Asian customers pay less for our gas than Australians do. Go figure. A small amount of it is kept in the West, thanks to a policy of the Western Australian government to ensure 15% of the gas processed in the state is kept as a domestic reserve. And this has been for decades. However, this resource is primarily in Commonwealth waters, and my bill seeks to create a domestic reserve of gas from this resource that benefits all of us, not just Western Australia. This national reserve would address looming domestic shortages in this critical energy resource. Today's Australian Financial Review newspaper reminded readers the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, warned us back in March that East Coast gas exporters may have to break long-term sales contracts with Asian customers to prevent domestic customers running short. They wouldn't have to do it if my bill was passed. We'd have all the gas we'll need. And make no mistake, we'll need it as Labor and the Greens continue with the suicidal rush to unreliable renewables. Gas is essential to make renewables work. Labor and the Greens won't acknowledge this truth, but the evidence is undeniable. Electricity grids require sustained input that intermittent renewables just cannot provide. Gas is the only available dispatchable backup in many cases, thanks to the premature closure of coal-fired power stations across the country. Forget green hydrogen as a replacement for gas. That's a green pipe dream that does not stack up economically and very likely never will. We're nowhere near having it available to us, not for at least another 20 years. It's all pie in the sky dream. Now we're going to need gas for a very long time to come, since Labor has decided to have 82% of our energy generated by wind and solar by 2030. Pie in the sky stuff. My bill will create that critical reserve of this essential energy resource. It will help stabilise prices and help stabilise our increasingly fragile and unreliable energy grids. Petroleum and gas resource companies will make the usual noises about sovereign risk. Their representative said as much to my office today. But it's a joke. It is a lie. Western Australia has had its domestic gas reserve policy in place since 2006, and investment by resource companies in that state has only increased. The experience overseas puts the lie to the sovereign risk argument too. The foreign-owned multinationals who whine about sovereign risk in Australia have no problem operating in countries like Norway. They have no problem operating in Qatar, as I said, which generates $26 billion a year in revenue from natural gas exports compared to $200 or $300 million generated in Australia. That's all we were getting. They've been so used to getting their way with the major parties, so of course they're going to complain. My bill will amend Section 95 of the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act 2006 to include references to a condition that petroleum and gas producers must enter into a domestic reserve agreement with the Commonwealth. The substantial amendment is the introduction of a new Section 162A. This new section provides that licensees will have 12 months to enter into a domestic reserve agreement from the 1st of January next year if this licence was or is generated before then. That licenses will have 12 months to enter an agreement from the day the licence is granted if this happens after the 1st of January next year. That for each year the agreement or licence operates, the licensee reserves an amount of petroleum or gas equivalent to 15% of the amount exported by the licensee the previous year, and provides that such agreements must operate for a minimum of 10 years. If the first contract expires but the production licence is still in force, licensees will be required to enter a new agreement. The really curious thing about this legislation is that it shouldn't be controversial and shouldn't enjoy universal support in this parliament, with the obvious expectation of the Greens, who have less economic expertise than your average guinea pig. Why would it be controversial for the Australian people to receive any sort of economic benefit from the resources which belong to them? I urge all senators to remember they're not here to represent the interests of foreign-owned multinationals or Asian importers of Australian gas. They're here to represent the interests of the Australian people, and my bill advances their interests. And as a lot of people would say, and you vote against this, and I know your attitude towards, because One Nation puts up these bills, that you won't support what we put up, and a lot of it's common sense and it's for the Australian people. But I'm urging you to really think about this. We're in shortage of gas. We're exported around about $4 a gigajoule for gas to overseas countries, and Australians here have paid up to $28 a gigajoule for gas. Do you really believe that's fair on the Australian people? And with this bill, it will ensure that we do have a gas supply. We've got enormous reserves, and we should be utilising it to ensure that households, those mums and dads, aged pensioners, and people have a supply of energy needs in this country. We've got industries and manufacturing that will go under. If you look at realistically, your renewables will not work. They can't stand up. In South Australia, they rely on gas for their needs because the wind doesn't always blow and the solar panels don't work at night. You have to have another supply. The dream of having a hydrogen, green hydrogen, it's not possible. There's nowhere in the world where it works. You're only lying to the Australian people and saying that we're going to have this. And it's all pie in the sky. You're cheating the Australian people. You're lying to the Australian people. You're lying about the environment and saying that the world's coming to an end or we're going to have rising costs, temperature rises, which is all lies. If we go up 0.5%, so what I'm saying here is the Australian people are struggling. Their energy costs are going through the roof. People are losing their homes because they can't pay the mortgages, the rising costs, and this all comes down to energy. But if we had this wealth fund, like I explained, Norway has it, a tremendous wealth fund that they've gained from their resources over there, and we've been so stupid in this country, we haven't done it. We've had governments who don't have the long-term vision, or members of parliament have never had the long-term vision as we did in a century ago with our politicians here. It's just you're here just for your term that you're here, and all you want to do is make sure that you make the right decisions to win your seats back again. But you're not making the right decisions for long-term vision for this nation. And it's a shame because it is the Australian people that's missing out on this. This is a great opportunity that we have to actually recover some money from our resources that we could put into good use. You know, we're struggling with hospitals, your rural and regional areas, closing down hospitals, your schools, our infrastructure, the roads are an absolute blasted mess. There's so much waste of government monies. And you're scratching around and you're talking about now, and you're going to bring in a productivity commissioner who's talking about, heritage tax, that's a death duties tax, raising the GST, more taxes on the Australian people, hitting the independent retirees, looking at possibly taking the family home from age pension to include it in the assets. So it's all you think about is taxing the Australian people constantly all the time without thinking. Use your brains and be also not only politicians, which you've got to have, problem solving, but a lot of you have no background experience in business, how to run a business. You wouldn't have a clue. You're absolutely brain dead when it comes to things like this where you can make money for this country. You know how to bloody spend it, but you have no idea how to actually make it. And this is what I've been for years in this place. I've been begging former Prime Ministers how to go with the PRRT, and finally we've got it, and guess what? $2.4 billion, and possibly we'll end up with more than that, because you've actually listened to what I've had to say. Start listening to the grassroots and start caring about the grassroots Australian people and start making them some money instead of knowing how to spend it all the time. Waste, as far as I'm concerned, absolute bloody waste. Start learning how to make money, and this will be a good start.